I'm Meredith Collins. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my life, I tried so hard just to be seen to matter to my family. But last week, when I looked my parents in the eyes, they told me they regretted having me. Not because I'd done something wrong, but simply because I wasn't the daughter they wanted me to be. That moment shattered everything I'd been holding on to for nearly 3 decades. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments. And if you've ever felt invisible to your own family, hit like and subscribe. I read every single one. I grew up in a quiet suburb just outside Chicago, the middle child in a family that seemed perfect from the outside. My parents believed in kindness, humility, and working hard values they said were important to all of us. But their idea of who mattered was clear. My older sister Emily was the golden child. She was smart, charming, the one who got the spotlight. Meredith was always in the background, the one who tried not to rock the boat. We weren't wealthy. My dad worked as an accountant. My mom was a nurse, and money was tight. But my parents wanted to give us what they could, sometimes more than they should have stretched for. They pushed Emily's dreams, bought her nice clothes, and supported her ambitions. Me, I kept my head down, held back my own dreams, and tried to fit the mold they had for me. Quiet, compliant, invisible. I poured everything I had into being the good daughter. I was the one who never caused trouble, who stayed home when the rest of the family was out. When I got a scholarship to a local art school, I thought maybe that was my way out, a way to prove I mattered. But even then, my successes were met with polite nods, never real excitement. Last Saturday, I found myself standing in front of the old family house again. The paint on the porch was chipped, the garden overgrown. I held a small box of homemade cookies, hoping to bridge the distance. The door opened to my mom's cool smile and my sister's distracted greeting. The warmth I remembered was gone, replaced by a quiet tension that squeezed my chest. I tried to share my news. My first art show had drawn over 200 people, even a write-up in the local paper. But my words floated past them, ignored or dismissed. Then came the silence that felt louder than any shout. My parents confessed, without hesitation, that they regretted having me. I stood there, the weight of those words settling like a stone in my stomach. It wasn't that I had failed them. I just hadn't been the daughter they wanted, the one they bragged about. That day I realized something painful but clear. My place in this family had never been secure. And that realization was only the beginning. I stood there in my parents' living room, my father's words echoing in my ears long after he and my mother had left the table. The world around me was still the sound of a distant clock, ticking the faint hum of the fridge. My sister Emily's laughter drifted down the hallway, muffled, as she chatted with Mom about her new job in Boston. I felt like a stranger in a house that once felt like home. I walked over to the wall where all our family photos used to hang. There were plenty of pictures: Emily in her cap and gown at her college graduation, my brother Ben holding up his science fair trophy, Mom and Dad smiling on a summer vacation by the lake. I searched for myself in those frames, but my face was nowhere to be found. The one photo I remembered from my high school graduation, a little crooked dad's hand resting awkwardly on my shoulder, had vanished. In its place, there was a pale square on the wall, surrounded by faint lines where the dust hadn't settled. For a moment, I stood in front of that blank spot, feeling the emptiness press in. The air smelled like lemon cleaner and stale coffee. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that it was just a picture. But I remembered what it was like to be 12, seeing my face in those frames, and feeling, at least for a moment, that I belonged. Now there was no trace of me at all. I picked up the box of cookies I'd brought and quietly slipped out the front door. The sun had warmed the porch steps, but the house behind me felt colder than ever. I walked down the driveway, hearing the sound of my own footsteps and nothing else. My car was parked just down the street, under the old maple tree that used to drop red leaves every fall. I sat in the driver's seat, the cookies untouched beside me, and stared at my hands on the steering wheel. I don't know how long I stayed there. At some point I started the car and drove home without really seeing the road. The sky was clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something important had slipped away for good. When I got back to my apartment, everything was as I'd left it. The curtains still open, sunlight streaming in across the carpet. I set the cookies on the kitchen counter and stood for a minute just listening to the quiet. I took off my coat and reached for the old green scarf my mother had given me years ago. It still smelled faintly of her perfume, and for a second I almost smiled. I hung it on the hook next to the door and noticed the empty hook beside it, one I always left free, hoping someone would visit. I moved through the apartment, my steps slow and careful, as if I was walking through someone else's memories. Later that night, I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser and started to go through some of my old things. Birthday cards, school ribbons, a stack of report cards. I found a plain white envelope with my name written in blue ink. Inside was a birthday card from when I was 9, no decorations, just a simple "Love Mom and Dad" at the bottom. I flipped it over hoping for something more, but the back was blank. I set it aside and reached for another card. This one from Emily's 11th birthday, covered in bright drawings, and a long message written by Mom about how Emily was the heart of our family. She'd even read it out loud at dinner that year, her voice full of pride. I could still hear the way the whole table had clapped, the way Mom looked at her with so much joy. I closed the drawer and sat on the floor, feeling the roughness of the carpet beneath my legs. I pulled out my old diary, its cover faded and corners bent. I hadn't looked at it in years. I turned to a random page and saw my handwriting, neat, careful letters, written by a girl who wanted so much to be understood. One line stood out. "Someday I'll matter enough for them to be glad I was born." My chest tightened. I whispered it out loud, my voice barely more than a breath. Someday. A couple of days passed in a blur. I moved through my routines, making coffee in the morning, sitting by the window in the afternoon, but everything felt heavier. I barely tasted my food, barely noticed when the mail came. On Sunday morning, my phone buzzed with a message from my mother. "Brunch at 11, private room booked, be there." There was no greeting, no apology, just the usual expectation that I'd show up. I thought about ignoring it, but something inside me said I had to go. I needed to see if anything had changed, or if I was still just a shadow in their lives. The restaurant was in the middle of town, the kind of place with white tablecloths and soft music playing in the background. I arrived early, clutching my purse and trying to smooth the wrinkles in my dress. The hostess led me through the main dining area to a private room at the back. There was a long table set for 10, my parents, my siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles. Laughter floated through the air, and everyone seemed at ease, sharing stories and pouring coffee. Next to the main table near a window overlooking the parking lot was a small table set for 2. The hostess pointed me there. "You're with the Collins party, right?" I nodded, though my hands shook a little. She smiled politely and pulled out a chair for me. I sat feeling the distance between me and the rest of my family. From my seat I could hear the clinking of silverware, the laughter of my cousin's kids as they played nearby. Every so often someone would glance my way, but no one invited me over, no one called my name. My mother stood and lifted her glass. "Here's to Emily's promotion, regional manager at last, and to Ben's engagement. You two are the pride of our family." There were cheers, toasts, even a few jokes from my uncle. I lifted my own glass and took a sip, my name never spoken. When dessert arrived, I excused myself and walked to the restroom. In the mirror, I barely recognized the woman staring back, tired eyes, forced smile. I whispered to my reflection, "Even here, I have to disappear for everyone else to feel comfortable." When I returned to the table, Emily leaned over and whispered, You know they only invited you so you wouldn't cause a scene." I didn't reply. I just nodded, picked up my bag, and left quietly. On the drive home, I let the silence settle around me. I didn't turn on the radio. I watched the trees slide past the window and tried not to think about the things I couldn't change. Back at my apartment, I didn't bother taking off my shoes. I just stood there, coat still buttoned, the room feeling smaller than usual. My phone buzzed a new email notification. I almost ignored it, but the subject line caught my eye. Updated trust structure, Collins Family Holdings. It was from a law firm my parents had used years before during the estate issues when Grandpa passed. I opened the message. My name wasn't listed anywhere. There was a note at the bottom, Emily Collins, to serve as sole trustee and inheritor of the family lake house. I sat down on the couch, the phone still in my hand. I felt a wave of cold run through me, and I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. When I was 26, just starting out as an artist, the family lake house was at risk of foreclosure. My parents called me asking for help. I emptied my savings account $40,000 so they could pay the taxes and keep the property. My mother had hugged me tight and whispered, "You'll always have a home here." Now, all these years later, that promise was gone, erased like my face from the family wall. I set the phone down and went to my closet, pulling out the box where I kept important papers. There I found a copy of the transfer receipt from when I'd sent the money. I ran my thumb over my signature, wondering if it had ever really mattered. I called my father. When he answered, I didn't hesitate. "When were you going to tell me about the trust update?" He paused, his voice suddenly distant. "Meredith, things have been complicated. You've been distant. Emily will handle things now." In the background, I heard Emily's voice, sharp, impatient. "Just tell her it's done." I hung up. I didn't cry. I just sat there staring at the blank TV screen, feeling like the world had shrunk to the size of that empty spot on the family wall. I realized then that I hadn't just been ignored. I had been erased. That night, as I sat alone in the dark, the city lights blinking through my window, I wondered how much more I could give before there was nothing left of me. But something inside me began to stir, a feeling I hadn't known in a long time. I didn't know what it meant yet. I just knew I couldn't keep letting them write me out of my own story. That night, sleep barely touched me. I lay in the dark, listening to the hum of traffic below my apartment window, the city carrying on without a clue that my world had shifted. Morning crept in slow and gray, and I moved through the hours on autopilot. I fixed a cup of coffee, barely tasting it. The kitchen clock ticked, and I caught myself standing in front of the refrigerator, staring at the magnet where I used to pin up my best report cards. Back then, I'd hoped my parents might notice just once that I was trying. Now the magnet just held grocery lists and a faded coupon for takeout. Later that day, I opened the bottom drawer of my dresser and sat cross-legged on the carpet, feeling the old ache in my knees. My fingers wandered through cards and small keepsakes, little scraps I'd saved when it felt like the only way to keep my place in the family. A birthday card from my 9th year lay near the top, just my name and "Love Mom and Dad" written inside. No note, no message, just proof that a card had been given. Next to it was another card, this one for Emily Bright, and full of handwritten love hearts and curly letters. I closed the card and set it aside, the edges worn from years of being handled. In the back of the drawer was a faded diary. I flipped through the pages, the writing careful and small. I'd written secrets, wishes, little promises to myself. One line jumped out from an old entry. "Maybe if I'm good enough, they'll see me." I paused. My thumb pressed to the page. The words didn't sting so much as settle heavy and quiet, as if the child I once was had been waiting years for someone to answer. Sometimes memories return when you least expect them. As I sat there, I remembered a moment from long ago, standing just outside the kitchen, half hidden behind a curtain. I'd meant to ask Mom if I could open a second gift for my birthday, but her voice stopped me. "We should have stopped at 2, she said, her voice low but clear. Dad answered, "Too late now. She's here. Just don't let her feel it." My breath caught in my throat. That night, I'd smiled for pictures, thanked them for the cake, and pretended not to hear. Now the memory replayed sharp and bright, filling the quiet space of my living room. I spent the next couple of days moving through my routines, not quite present in my own life. I made dinner, set out my art supplies, and tried to keep busy, but everything felt faded, as if I was watching myself from the outside. I thought about the lake house, the savings I'd sent without hesitation. The words my mother had whispered, "You'll always have a home here," had seemed true at the time. Now they felt like lines from a story someone else had written. I pulled out the folder where I'd saved every letter about the house, the transfer receipts, even the email my father had sent thanking me for helping out. My handwriting on the paperwork was careful, hopeful. I'd believed that love and loyalty meant something permanent. I called my friend Nora that evening. She had always known how to let silence sit between us without making it awkward. "Do you want to come over?" she asked. I shook my head, even though she couldn't see me. "I just needed to hear a friendly voice," I said. We talked for a while about nothing and everything. She didn't push, and I didn't explain. Sometimes that's all you need. The next morning, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from the family attorney, old and formal, with my name typed on the envelope. Inside was a copy of the trust amendment legal language, laid out in stark black and white. Emily was the sole trustee now. My contribution to the lake house wasn't mentioned. I set the letter on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. I could hear neighbors laughing in the hallway, their lives moving forward, while mine seemed stuck. For a moment, I wondered what it would be like to walk away completely, to leave the city, the memories, the ache of trying to belong where I never truly fit. But as the sun started to set, painting the windows in gold and pink, I realized I wasn't ready to disappear. Not yet. I put the letter in the drawer with my other keepsakes and closed it gently. Days stretched on. The world outside moved with spring buds on the trees, neighbors raking lawns, children biking down the street. I watched from my window, feeling like a ghost in my own life. At work, I smiled and made small talk, keeping my troubles tucked away. In the evenings, I sketched in my notebook lines and shapes, forming without much thought. I wasn't sure what I was drawing. Sometimes a house by the water, sometimes a family gathered around a table, but the pictures made more sense than words. One night, I found myself walking the familiar blocks back toward my childhood neighborhood. The houses all looked the same, but the porch lights felt dimmer somehow. I paused at the end of the street, looking up at the old maple tree, where I'd once built a fort with Ben. I stayed there for a while, just listening to the wind and the branches, and letting the memories come and go as they pleased. In those quiet days, I realized I was waiting for something, a sign, an answer, a way to reclaim what I'd lost. But all I had was silence. I carried it with me in my pockets, in my shoes, in the space behind my ribs. The ache was constant, but it became familiar, almost a companion. On a Sunday evening, I found myself writing again. This time the words came slowly but steadily. I wrote about what it felt like to be left out to watch the people you love turn away. I wrote about the birthday card, the empty place on the wall, the lake house that was no longer mine. I didn't know if anyone would ever read those pages, but I needed to set them down. I closed my notebook and sat by the window, the city quiet beneath a pale sky. For the first time in weeks, I let myself rest, knowing tomorrow might bring something different. The shadows had grown longer, but I was still here, and somewhere inside a new resolve was beginning to take root. Spring settled in, softening the edges of the city, and I found myself walking more, letting the long days pull me outside. The world seemed brighter, but inside I still carried the chill of what my family had done. I spent evenings at my kitchen table, sorting through old letters and bills, the paperwork that comes from years of living, and trying to hold things together. One afternoon, while looking for a missing insurance card, I came across a folder I hadn't opened in ages. Tucked inside was a notarized letter, the yellowed paper stamped and signed. It was a contribution statement for the lake house dated nearly a decade earlier, my name in careful script, the amount I'd given, and my parents' signatures at the bottom. I stared at the page, the memory returning in pieces. That was the year the bank threatened foreclosure, and my parents called me late at night, their voices shaking. I had just started selling paintings, barely scraping by, but I transferred everything I had to help them keep the house. Mom hugged me in the kitchen, her eyes full for once. "You'll always have a home here," she said. I'd believed it. Now, seeing my name on that page, I wondered if it had ever mattered at all. I needed answers. The next morning, I called Mr. Halverson, an old friend of my late uncle's, who handled some of the family's legal paperwork. His voice was gentle, steady. "Of course I remember you, Meredith," he said. I asked if he still had a copy of the original property letter I'd signed. There was a pause, and I could hear him shuffling papers in the background. After a few minutes, he came back on the line. "Yes, I have it here. March 3rd, 2012. Your contribution is listed and it's notarized. Your parents and you all signed." He paused again. "But I should tell you the trust was amended in 2021. That was when you were in the hospital. I only know because I was asked to notarize the change." The words didn't land right away. "I never signed anything that year," I said. "I was recovering from surgery. I wasn't even there." He let out a soft sigh full of regret. "I thought it was strange at the time, but I was told you'd already agreed." After we hung up, I sat at my kitchen table staring out the window at the branches waving in the wind. My coffee grew cold in my hands, but I didn't move. I remembered the hospital room, sterile, humming with machines. No visitors from my family, just a single card from Nora on the side table. I told myself they were busy, that they would visit if they could. Now the truth was something colder. They had changed everything when I was at my weakest. By late afternoon, the apartment was bathed in soft gold light. I turned on the radio, letting old country songs fill the space. I opened my notebook, tried to write, but only managed a single sentence. I was never really in the will, just in the way. I closed the cover and leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all pressing down on my shoulders. Evening fell, and I found myself at the window watching the streetlights flicker on. I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck and thought back over the years, every time I'd excused their behavior, every time I told myself not to take it personally. I had forgiven so much, convinced myself that if I just loved them harder, it would be enough. Now it was clear. I hadn't been forgotten. I had been written out on purpose. I let the thought settle. I didn't cry. I just breathed, letting the quiet wrap around me. For the first time in months, I felt a small shift inside, a kind of clarity that wasn't angry or bitter, just real. They hadn't overlooked me. They'd chosen to make me invisible. The next morning, I went for a walk down to the park, the trees just starting to bloom. I sat on a bench and watched a little boy toss a baseball with his grandfather, their laughter drifting over the grass. I closed my eyes and listened, letting the sounds of spring fill my chest. I realized I didn't want to spend my days waiting for an apology that would never come. I couldn't change my family, but I could decide what I would do with the truth. I walked home slowly, thinking about all the ways I'd tried to belong. By the time I reached my building, the air had warmed, and the scent of lilacs trailed after me up the steps. Inside, I placed the notarized letter in a folder on my desk, right next to my sketchbook. I set a mug of tea beside it and sat for a long time letting the stillness settle. In that moment, I understood my story wasn't over. It was changing. The ache was still there, but it wasn't the whole story. There was room now for something new, something honest. And for the first time in a long while, I was ready to see what would happen if I finally stood up for myself. I sat at my kitchen table that night, the city winding down beyond my window. The folder with my name on it rested in front of me inside the notarized letter from Mr. Halverson receipts copies of every bank transfer and message about the lake house. I ran my finger over the manila edge, thinking about all the ways I'd tried to keep peace, to not stir up trouble, to believe my parents' promises. The room was quiet except for the tick of the clock. When the first hint of sunrise colored the sky, I made my decision. I would go back, but this time I wasn't bringing a smile or a plate of cookies. I was bringing the truth. I drove across town in the early morning, the streets mostly empty mist rising from the grass along the old side roads. My hands were steady on the wheel. The neighborhood looked almost unchanged, the same trimmed hedges, the same swing creaking gently on my parents' porch. I parked and sat for a moment watching as curtains shifted in the front window. They knew I was here. I got out folder in hand and walked up the steps. My mother opened the door, her face carefully composed. "Meredith," she said, as if I was just stopping by to drop off something small. Emily stood behind her, arms crossed, coffee mug in hand. I didn't wait for anyone to ask why I'd come. I walked past them and placed my folder on the kitchen table. My father looked up from his phone but didn't say anything. "I'm not here for tea," I said. "I need to return something." I opened the folder and slid the documents toward my mother. She looked down, her lips pressed into a thin line. Emily leaned closer and scoffed. "You're still going on about this." I kept my voice even, careful. "You changed the trust while I was in the hospital. You erased my name from everything I helped save. You rewrote the story as if I'd never been a part of it." My father's jaw worked, but he stayed silent. I took out the letter from Mr. Halverson, setting it in the middle of the table. "Here's the original contribution letter from 2012. It has all of our signatures. I want you to look at it." For a moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the distant rumble of a garbage truck outside. My mother sat, her hand flat against the table, knuckles pale. Emily's voice sharpened. "You were barely present after that surgery. We made the decision that was best for everyone." I let her words hang in the air. "No, you made the decision that was best for you." I placed the last piece of paper on the table, a formal notice from my attorney. "We're beginning mediation. I'm not asking anymore. I'm telling you." My father looked up, a flicker of something regret, or maybe just surprise in his eyes, but no apology came. I gathered the empty folder and turned to leave the sound of my footsteps clear against the kitchen tile. No one followed me to the door. As I stepped outside, I felt the air shift, as if something heavy had been left behind. The drive home was quiet. The silence wasn't sharp with pain like before. It was level, almost steady. I parked, walked up the steps to my apartment, and took off my shoes. I set the folder on the counter and watched as evening light settled over the city. I stood by the window, feeling a different kind of stillness. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for someone else to make things right. Later that week, an envelope arrived. Inside was a letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. I opened it slowly, scanning the crisp pages. Emily had filed a countersuit claiming I was too unstable to be trusted with anything tied to the family estate. She listed therapy appointments and mentioned the accident details twisted to paint me as someone fragile, unreliable. I sat down on the edge of my couch, the letter in my lap. The room felt smaller, but I didn't fold. I placed the letter in the folder with the rest and put it away. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from the community nonprofit where I used to volunteer. They were hosting a panel, Invisible Work, the unseen labor of women, and someone remembered I'd spoken at their fundraiser years ago. They asked if I would speak again. My hand hovered over the reply. Then I typed, "I'll be there." A few days later, I found myself backstage at a small community center, clutching a folder with my notes. The room smelled like coffee and dust chairs arranged in neat rows. I waited for my name to be called, listening to the sounds of conversation on the other side of the door. When it was my turn, I stepped up to the microphone, looked out at the faces, some older, some younger, and took a breath. I spoke about the work we do that no one sees. I shared how I'd spent years trying to belong, how I'd given my time, my money, my care, hoping to be counted as part of the family. I said the words, simply not searching for pity or applause. When I finished, I set my notes aside. For a moment, the room was still. Emily's voice rang out from the back, sharp and clear. "She's always been emotional. Our family did the best we could." I met her eyes, steady and calm. "I did have a breakdown," I said, "because I spent most of my life being written out of my own story." I held up a single sheet of paper, a diary page I'd found years ago, written by a little girl who wanted to matter. I didn't read it aloud. I just looked at it then, at the women in the room. Some people clapped. Some just nodded. As I stepped down, I felt the weight of the folder in my hands. It wasn't just paperwork or proof. It was a record of what I'd survived and what I'd done to reclaim my own place. That night back at home, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, feeling the breeze and the quiet. The city lights blinked in the distance, and for the first time I let myself rest. A few days after the panel, the sun came up behind heavy clouds, and I found myself awake before dawn. I walked through my apartment, pausing at the window to watch the city lights blink out as morning took over. The folder from the mediation still sat on my kitchen table, a silent reminder of what I'd finally faced. For the first time, the air didn't feel quite so heavy. That morning, as I poured a cup of coffee, my email pinged with a new message. The sender was a name I hadn't seen in years. Arthur LaRue, my father's longtime attorney. The subject line was short. "Something your father wanted you to have." I read it twice before opening the message. It was brief. Arthur wrote that before Dad's bypass surgery the previous year, he'd asked him to hold on to an important document for me. Now Arthur believed it was time I received it. There was an invitation to meet Thursday at his office and a line that read, "It's all in his handwriting." Thursday arrived with a low sky gray and restless. I took the train downtown, watching rain blur the sidewalks as we pulled into the station. Arthur's office still looked the same dark wood, old books, the kind of place that felt unchanged by time. He greeted me quietly, sliding an envelope across the desk. I sat and opened it with careful hands. Inside was an addendum to my father's will, dated 11 months earlier, and a single line in Dad's familiar script, "To Meredith, because I finally see who held our family together when no one else could." I read that line 3 times before looking up at Arthur. He nodded his eyes kind, but he didn't speak. The document listed legal amendments, my name restored to the trust co-ownership of the lake house made official, other small details that showed Dad had taken steps to set things right. The city seemed softer. As I left the office, the rain slowing to a mist. I stopped by a corner bakery, buying myself a cinnamon roll and a cup of coffee, and sat in a window seat to read the document again. The words stayed with me all the way home, grounding me in a way nothing else had for years. The next morning, I drove back to my parents' house. This time, there was no folder to shield me, just the sealed envelope and steady hands. Mom answered the door, confusion flickering across her face. "Meredith, "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I'm not here to argue," I said quietly. "I just wanted you to know the truth was never lost. You chose not to see it." I placed the envelope in her hand. Through the paper, she could see Dad's handwriting at the top. Dad appeared in the hallway, moving slowly. For a moment, our eyes met. Then I turned and walked away, my shoes crunching over the old welcome mat. As I reached the sidewalk, I heard the screen door open. Dad stepped onto the porch, sitting heavily on the bench, the envelope already open in his lap. His shoulders shook. From the street, I could see the diary pages I'd included, my childhood handwriting, the words of a girl desperate to be enough. His head bowed, his hand resting beneath a line that began, "I was 9 the first time I felt extra." I saw his frame shake with silent sobs, and for the first time I didn't look back. Inside, through the window, I caught a glimpse of Mom. She was sitting in the hallway, arms crossed tight over her chest, her face unreadable, but her whole body tense. I walked to my car and closed the door gently behind me, letting the silence hold me. Back at home that night, I stood by my window with a cup of tea. My phone buzzed a message from Emily. "I hope you're happy. You broke them." I let the message sit on the screen for a moment, then deleted it without answering. I didn't need to reply. 3 weeks passed. The city slid into late spring, the trees greening overnight, the air sweeter than before. One evening, while I was unpacking boxes at the small cabin by the lake, I found the red ribbon from my childhood tucked under a loose floorboard. I held it in my hands, feeling the soft, frayed edges. I tied it around a new notebook, the pages blank and full of promise. The next day, I taught my first creative writing class at the community center. The room was bright, filled with the scent of whiteboard markers and hope. A girl named Lily, no older than 15, raised her hand and asked, "Does it ever stop hurting?" I paused, watching the other students listen. "Not always," I said, "but it stops defining you." She nodded, and for a moment the room felt lighter. The chain of old grief loosened just a little. I looked out at the faces in the classroom, and for the first time I felt the shift inside me. I wasn't invisible anymore. The days after that morning at my parents' house passed in a hush, the world shifting quietly, as if something weighty had finally let go. I spent the first few weeks at the lake cabin unpacking boxes and painting walls a warm clay color. I kept busy in small ways, stacking books on the shelf, mending curtains, planting a row of marigolds along the back fence. The house felt empty at first, but it wasn't a lonely kind of quiet. Each night I made tea and sat on the porch listening to the sound of water lapping at the dock and the call of a loon across the lake. There was one photo I placed above the fireplace, a picture of myself at 8 years old, hair tied back with a red ribbon and a wide, uncertain smile. She didn't know much, but she already knew how to carry things quietly. Next to the photo, I framed a torn diary page, one I'd written and hidden years ago, the words faded but still clear. It sat under glass not as a wound, but as proof that I'd always been there, even when no one else noticed. On a warm Thursday afternoon, while sweeping the screened porch, I found something small and familiar wedged beneath a floorboard, the red ribbon from my childhood. I held it for a long time, smoothing out the creases and frayed ends. Later, I wrapped it around the new notebook I'd started since moving to the cabin, the pages blank except for a single line on the first, "You are here. You are enough." The act of tying the ribbon was quiet, almost ceremonial, like closing a door gently, but for good. In the evenings, I taught creative writing at the community center in town. The classroom always smelled of dry erase markers and old library books. My students, mostly teenagers and a few adults trying something new, shared their stories with a mix of courage and caution. On my second night, a girl named Lily raised her hand and asked, "Does it ever stop hurting?" I paused before answering, weighing my words, and said, It might not go away all at once, but it does get lighter. You learn how to carry it differently." She nodded and gave a small, grateful smile, and I watched the relief settle across her shoulders. Sometimes after class, I'd walk back to the cabin by the long way past the church, with the green steeple and the old general store that never seemed to close. I'd listen to the frogs singing along the ditch, the air thick with summer. At home, I'd write about the day, just small notes, memories, and the lessons I wanted to hold on to. The cabin became a place where I could just be. There was no need to perform or defend myself, no expectation to fill a role. The ache from before was still there, but it softened as I let myself settle into the life I was building. I read back through old letters and let the wind carry away what no longer belonged to me. I realized bit by bit that justice didn't have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was as simple as knowing you had told the truth and stood your ground, even if no one applauded. Late one evening, as I sat on the porch with a mug of cinnamon tea, the lake shimmering in the dusk, I thought about all the ways I had tried to be enough for my family. The words from my father's letter came back to me, an acknowledgement that had arrived late, but not too late. I felt the chain loosen just a bit more. As the crickets began their nightly chorus, I whispered into the dark, "You did it. You made it through." I wasn't speaking to anyone in particular, maybe just that 8-year-old girl in the picture, or maybe to every woman who had ever felt invisible in her own home. That summer at the cabin brought a kind of quiet I'd never known before. The air smelled of pine and lake water, and most evenings I'd sit on the porch notebook in my lap, watching the sun sink low behind the trees. I found myself moving slowly, taking time with every meal, every small routine. I let the stillness settle around me and realized I no longer needed to prove anything, not to my family, not even to myself. I hung the photo of that little girl with the red ribbon above the mantel next to the framed diary page that once made my chest ache. Now those mementos reminded me how far I'd come and that even the hardest chapters deserved to be remembered. Sometimes forgiveness comes quietly. One evening, I took out a letter I'd written months before after that hospital stay when no one showed up. The words were simple, a line about letting go and another about wanting to be enough. I read it once, then carried it outside to the fire pit behind the cabin. The paper curled and blackened in the flames, and I watched it drift into the cool air, feeling a weight I'd carried for years finally lift. I understood then that apologies might never come, and that sometimes the only way forward is to stop waiting for them. While sweeping the porch, I found my old red ribbon again, tucked beneath a floorboard. I wrapped it around my new journal, smiling at the thought of fresh pages and the quiet power of starting forward, not over. Teaching at the community center became my anchor. Each week, I saw faces light up with possibility, folks of all ages bringing their stories, hoping to be heard. On my last day that season, Lily stayed behind after class. She hugged her notebook to her chest and asked if I ever regretted being honest, even when it hurt. I told her that honesty had never broken me. It was what made me whole. Nights grew longer, the lake shining beneath the stars. I'd sit in the glow of the porch light and whisper sometimes to the girl I used to be, sometimes to anyone out there who might be listening. I remembered how often I'd wished for someone to say, "You mattered." But now I saw that I'd been right all along. My value was never decided by anyone else's silence or approval. Justice, I learned, isn't always about what we win or lose. It's about standing firm in who we are and allowing ourselves to build peace even when others never offer it. If you've ever felt erased or overlooked by people who should have seen you, I hope you'll remember this. You are not invisible. You have always mattered, and peace isn't something handed to you. It's something you choose every day. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched you or brought back a memory of your own, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, you're welcome to subscribe or just join me again next time. Take care of yourself and know that your story matters too.